In the spring of 1912, a French colonial survey officer named Lieutenant Marcel Renaud led a three-man geological team into the Tassili-Niger Plateau, in what is now southeastern Algeria, assigned to map subsurface water sources for a proposed French military resupply route. On the fourth day of the survey, his team's local guide, a Tuareg elder named Moussa Ag Alafou, who had been contracted through the garrison at Fort Polignac, stopped at a dry wadi bed and refused to walk further. He pointed to a natural fissure in the sandstone escarpment to their east, approximately 60 feet wide at its widest point, and disappearing at an angle into the rock. He used a word that Renaud transliterated phonetically in his field journal as something close to I Helen, a Tamashek word that his interpreter translated, haltingly, as the ones who came before the people. Renaud noted the fissure. His geological brief required him to investigate potential aquifer structures. He entered. He was gone for 2 hours and 40 minutes. When he came back out, his two subordinates later testified in separate depositions. He was silent for an interval one of them estimated at 15 minutes. Then, he began writing. He wrote in his field journal for the rest of that afternoon and did not stop until the light failed. The journal ran to 31 pages before Moussa Ag Alafou built the campfire that evening. By the time Renaud returned to Fort Polignac 11 days later, he had written 68 pages. He handed the journal to the garrison commander. He was transferred to a desk posting in Algiers within 30 days. He never led a field survey again. The official record of Renaud's 1912 survey is a single-page report filed with the Service Géographique de l'Arme in Paris. Describing the route as geologically unremarkable, water sources insufficient for resupply purposes, survey concluded without incident. The field journal, 68 pages, written in the field over 11 days in the Tassili Plateau, is not referenced in the official report. It does not appear in the inventory of the Service Géographique's holdings for 1912. It is not in the garrison archive at what is now the Algerian military facility that replaced Fort Polignac. The two subordinates who accompanied Renaud gave separate depositions, a standard procedure when a field officer was transferred within 30 days of returning from assignment, in which both described watching him write continuously for days at a stretch, sometimes by lantern light, after dark. Both depositions are in the French Military Personnel Archive in Vincennes, in a collection of colonial service records that has been open to researchers since 1975. Neither deposition has been cited in any published account of French colonial survey operations in the Tassili region. Renaud was not an unstable man. He was not a junior officer prone to exaggeration. He was a 34-year-old trained survey engineer with 11 years of active field service across French North Africa, a man who had submitted 17 prior survey reports to the Service Géographique without a single notation of irregularity. His transfer to a desk posting in Algiers, executed within 30 days of his return, carried no official explanation in his personnel file. He held the desk posting for 14 months. He resigned his commission in July of 1913. He returned to France. He died in the trenches near Verdun in 1916. He was 38 years old. Whatever he wrote in those 68 pages has not been seen by anyone who has spoken publicly about it since Joyous Vallat read the first dozen pages in a Paris office in 1922. Before we go further, if you find these buried investigations as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe so the next one finds you when it drops. The algorithm tends to bury this kind of investigation, unless you tell it otherwise. To understand what Marcel Renaud walked into in the Tassili-Niger in the spring of 1912, you have to go back not just a few decades. You have to go back to a question that the official archaeology of the Sahara has been managing, carefully and with notable consistency, since the first systematic European expeditions into the region in the 1840s. The Sahara was not always a desert. The geological and climatological record is unambiguous on this point. Between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 years before the present, the region now occupied by the central and southern Sahara was a verdant savanna, a landscape with lakes, rivers, grasslands, and a climate capable of supporting large settled populations. This period is known to science as the African Humid Period, or the Green Sahara. The evidence for it is in the rock, lake sediment cores taken from beneath the current desert surface, pollen records, and the fossilized remains of hippos, crocodiles, and savanna fauna found hundreds of miles from the nearest water source today all confirm a landscape that is virtually unrecognizable compared to what exists there now. The Green Sahara was not a marginal or transitional environment. It was a productive, lake-dotted landscape that climatologists estimate supported human populations in the hundreds of thousands across its peak centuries. Those populations had millennia to develop, to build, and to accumulate the kind of material culture that, in other parts of the world, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, produced the first recognized civilizations. The official archaeology does not say that those populations built nothing permanent. It says that the evidence of what they built has not been found. That is a different statement. And the difference between those two statements is the question at the center of every account we will examine in this video. What the official archaeology has never satisfactorily explained is the question of what happened to the people who lived in that landscape when it began to dry. Not where they went, that is addressed provisionally by migration theory. What they left behind, what they built, and what is still down there, beneath 60 to 80 feet of blown sand and sandstone overburden, in a region that no systematic subsurface archaeological survey has ever been funded to examine. The Tassili Najjer itself is not unknown to science. It is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site for its tens of thousands of rock paintings and engravings, some of them dating to the Green Sahara period, depicting cattle, elephants, hippos, and human figures in a landscape that simply does not exist in that location today. Those paintings have been studied, they have been photographed, catalogued, and written about extensively. What has not been studied, or rather, what has been studied and then quietly not published, is what lies beneath the plateau's surface, in the system of natural caverns, collapsed lava tubes, and eroded sandstone voids that the plateau's geology makes almost certain to exist at depth. The Tassili sits on a basement of ancient volcanic rock. The sandstone above that basement is riddled with fault lines. In a landscape that once had rivers and lakes, subsurface void space is not an anomaly. It is an expectation. What is anomalous is the consistent decision, across 130 years of French colonial and post-colonial archaeology in the region, never to excavate below the surface. Before we move further, if this is the kind of investigation that matters to you, subscribe and ring the bell. We pull these threads every single week. If you've ever looked at a map of the Sahara and felt that something about the official story of what is under that sand is incomplete, you belong here. Renaud was not the only European to report something beneath the Tassili surface in the early decades of the 20th century. In 1903, a German geologist named Dr. Ernst Kiefer, employed by the Deutsche Kolonialgesellschaft to assess potential mineral extraction sites in the Fezzan region of what is now southwestern Libya, submitted a report to his employer describing a natural shaft formation in the sandstone that he had partially descended. Kiefer was not an adventurer. He was a Heidelberg-trained geologist who had spent 8 years conducting mineral surveys in German Southwest Africa before his Fezzan assignment. He understood sandstone geology. He understood what natural void formation in karst and aeolian landscapes looks like. And he understood, specifically and in print, what it does not look like. Kiefer's report, a 40-page document with hand-drawn cross-sections, submitted in November of 1903, described what he encountered at approximately 55 feet below the surface as a worked space, non-natural in its regularity, with evidence of deliberate surface treatment on the stone walls of a kind inconsistent with any known geological process. He did not use the word artificial casually. The cross-sections he drew show a corbelled roof structure, a chamber width of approximately 14 meters, and what he described as a central stone platform with a smooth, flat surface approximately 2 meters in diameter and bearing incised marks of evident human origin. He noted that the air in the chamber was completely dry and that the stone surfaces, despite the chamber's apparent antiquity, showed no significant erosion from moisture. Dry preserved. Like Renault's account 9 years later. Like the Tassili Plateau conditions that Vallat would describe in 1948. The Deutsche Kolonialgesellschaft received Kiefer's report. The mineral survey was concluded. A follow-up expedition to the shaft was never funded. Kiefer's report remained in the Kolonialgesellschaft's archive until that organization was dissolved in 1936, transferred to the Bundesarchiv in Berlin, and has been catalogued there in the collection of dissolved colonial enterprise records ever since. It has been there for nearly 90 years. No archaeologist has cited it. In 1921, 9 years after Renault's survey, a British geographer named Captain David Holt seconded to the Royal Geographical Society for a mapping survey of the central Fezzan, reported in a letter to his expedition's sponsor that his team had found, near the base of an escarpment in the Merzuk Sand Sea, what appears to be a walled passage of some antiquity, sealed with dressed stone blocks that do not originate in the local geological formation. Holt's letter is in the Royal Geographical Society archive in London, filed with the 1921 Fezzan expedition correspondence. His formal report to the regs, submitted 3 months later, contains no reference to the walled passage. The omission is not explained in any subsequent correspondence in the same file. Tassili Najer, 1912, a French survey officer enters a fissure, writes 68 pages, and is transferred from field duty within the month, his journal unrecorded in any official inventory. Fezzan, 1903. A German geologist describes a worked stone chamber at 55 feet below grade with incised marks of evident human origin, and no follow-up is funded. Merzuk, 1921. A British geographer finds a walled passage of dressed stone and omits it entirely from his formal report. 3 expeditions, 3 nationalities, 3 independent accounts across 18 years and a geographic range of several hundred miles. This is not coincidence. This is a pattern. The Institut National d'Archéologie et d'Art in Paris, which has held primary custodianship over the Tassili Najer's archaeological record since the French colonial period, has never adequately addressed several specific questions. It has never explained why the Service Geographique's 1912 inventory for the year of Renault's survey contains no reference to a field journal that his own subordinates testified he was writing continuously for 11 days. It has never explained why a geological report describing a worked subsurface chamber in the Fezzan, filed in 1903 with a named institution whose archive is publicly accessible in Berlin, has never been examined by any researcher specializing in pre-Columbian African archaeology. It has never addressed the relationship between Renault's 1912 account, Kiefer's 1903 report, and Holt's 1921 letter. 3 independent witnesses describing the same category of subsurface construction across the same geological formation within 18 years. Why would a 34-year-old survey officer with an 11-year record of unremarkable reports write 68 pages in 11 days in the desert, hand the journal directly to his commanding officer, and be removed from field duty within 30 days, unless what he had written was something his commanding officer needed to contain rather than file? Why does the Deutsche Kolonialgesellschaftsarchiv in Berlin hold a 40-page geological report with hand-drawn cross-sections describing a worked stone chamber at 55 feet below grade in the Sahara? And why has that report sat uncited in that archive for more than 100 years? Why did Captain Holt include a description of a wall-dressed stone passage in a personal letter to his expedition's sponsor, but exclude it entirely from his formal report to the Royal Geographical Society? And why does the file in the Regs archive contain no explanation of the discrepancy? These questions do not go away because institutions refuse to answer them. But here is what makes Renault's case different from every other account of suppressed subsurface discovery in the Tassili region. In 1948, a retired French army archivist named Georges Vallat, who had worked in the Service Geographique's Paris offices from 1919 to 1944, processing the cartographic and survey records of the French colonial administration's field operations across North Africa, was contacted by a journalist at a regional newspaper in Lyon who was writing a retrospective piece on French colonial mapping. Vallat agreed to an interview. He was 63 years old. He had retired 4 years earlier. He had, by his own account to the journalist, been carrying the memory of one particular file for 26 years and had told no one. The interview was published in the Lyon paper in March of 1948. In it, Vallat stated, on the record, that during his time at the Service Geographique he had personally processed a file marked Tassili, a fair class, classified matter, created in 1912 and containing, among other materials, a field journal of 68 pages authored by a survey officer whose name he no longer recalled. He stated that the file had been removed from the Service Geographique's active holdings in 1922, 10 years after its creation, and transferred to a restricted archive operated by the Ministre de la Guerre, the French War Ministry. He stated that the journal described, in the survey officer's own words, a city, not a chamber, not a passage, not a worked stone platform. A city, stone buildings, arranged in rows, at a depth of between 40 and 80 feet below the plateau surface, preserved by the aridity of the enclosed space and accessible through a series of natural fissures in the escarpment. Vallat said he had read only the first dozen pages before the file was taken from him by a senior officer, and he was told that the contents were not a matter for the cartographic section. He said he had never seen the file again. The Lyon newspaper article ran on March 14, 1948. It was not picked up by any national publication. Georges Vallat died in 1953. The article is in the Lyon newspaper's archive. It has been there since 1948. No researcher working on Saharan archaeology has ever cited it. The Tassili Najr Plateau is still there. It is still listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Tourists visit its rock paintings every year. The sandstone escarpment, where Renault's Tuareg guide pointed and refused to walk further, is still there. The Tassili Plateau's geography has not changed materially in 100 years. The fissure Renault entered is still there, or was as of the most recent published geographical survey of the plateau, which dates to 1987, and which contains no reference to subsurface investigation. The sand that covers whatever lies beneath the plateau's surface has been deepening and stabilizing for 5,000 years. The aridity that Vallat's account says preserved stone buildings at 40 to 80 feet below grade is still functioning. The Sahara is, by any measure, one of the best natural preservation environments on Earth. Organic materials decay. Stone does not. Dressed stone in a sealed, dry subsurface chamber in the central Sahara would be in essentially the same condition today as it was when the last person who built it walked away from it, however many centuries or millennia ago that was. Whatever Marcel Renaud wrote 68 pages about in the spring of 1912, whatever Ernst Kiefer drew cross-sections of in 1903, whatever David Holt described in a letter he would not put in his formal report, is still down there. Dry, still, undisturbed, waiting for an excavation that has never been funded and never been proposed by any institution with the authority to conduct it. These records survive because people refuse to stop asking. If you've made it this far, you already understand that the most powerful archaeological sites in the world are not the ones that have been excavated. They are the ones that have been encountered, reported, and then, through a combination of institutional reflex, imperial convenience, and the simple human instinct to manage what cannot yet be explained, left exactly where they were found. Subscribe and share this with someone who thinks the Sahara has given up all its secrets. It has not. Renaud's journal is in a French War Ministry restricted archive that may not have been opened since 1922. Kiefer's 40-page report is in the Bundesarchiv in Berlin. The Lyon newspaper article is in the Lyon archive. The records have always been there. No one was told to look. Next week, I am tracing the Tamashek word that Musa Ag Alafo used, I-Helen, through a chain of Tuareg oral tradition records compiled by a French ethnographer named Henri Duveyrier between 1859 and 1864. Duveyrier spent 5 years living among the Tuareg. His published work described the surface culture. His unpublished notes, held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in a collection that was partially restricted until 1995, describe something else entirely. Something the Tuareg told him about what existed beneath the plateau that he chose not to put in print. You won't want to miss it.